An $80 million jet sat frozen inside the hangar the night the chief executive threw down her ultimatum before the entire technical staff. "Fix it before sunrise," she said, "or walk away for good." Mason Carter, a single father everyone dismissed as a glorified mechanic, did not argue. He unclipped his badge, closed his toolbox, and began packing his things. A few nearby engineers laughed, certain he was bluffing, until every system on the aircraft went dark at once. Lawyers came sprinting into the hangar, and the CEO finally understood what Mason was carrying out the door with him. Stay with this story until the end to discover exactly why Mason's silence sent the entire aviation empire into chaos. 12 hours before that ultimatum, Orlean Aviation was preparing for the most important demonstration flight in the company's history. The Orlean 9 was the newest generation of private business jet, marketed as the safest flight control system ever built for civilian use. A government delegation and a group of international investors were scheduled to watch the flight the following morning. If the demonstration succeeded, Orlean would secure a $3 billion contract and pull itself back from the edge of bankruptcy. If it failed, the banks would freeze every line of credit, and thousands of employees could lose their jobs within weeks. Amelia Grace had held the chief executive position for only 8 months. The board never stopped measuring her against her late father, the man who had built this company from a single hangar and a handful of mechanics. Ryan Hunter, chairman of the board, warned her plainly that this flight was her last real chance to prove she belonged in the seat she now occupied. Connor Wyatt, the chief operating officer, kept insisting that everything was ready, that nothing stood between Orlean and the biggest contract in its history except Mason Carter's habit of slowing down every schedule with requests for one more inspection. Mason had found something strange in the tail control system, a flicker in the signal that lasted only a fraction of a second. It was so brief that standard diagnostic software never flagged it as a warning. He asked for the flight to be delayed so the entire signal pathway could be tested from end to end. Connor mocked him openly, asking why a $3 billion contract should be held hostage by a signal glitch too small for any machine to even notice. Amelia turned to Mason and asked for clear evidence before she would consider any delay. Mason admitted he could not yet identify the source of the flaw, but he was certain of one thing. This aircraft could not be allowed to fly until he understood it. He explained, calmly and without drama, that the worst disasters in aviation history almost always began as small signals that someone with authority chose to dismiss. Amelia began to wonder whether Mason was stalling out of resentment, still bitter over being passed over for a promotion months earlier. Nobody in that hangar knew that Connor had already built a plan of his own, one designed to turn Mason into the fall guy the moment anything went wrong. The pressure in the room was already suffocating before Mason had even finished his explanation. Engineers glanced nervously between their screens and the clock mounted above the hangar doors, counting down the hours until sunrise. Amelia felt the weight of every investor, every banker, and every board member pressing down on her decision. She had inherited a legacy she was still learning how to carry, and she refused to be the executive who let it collapse on her watch. Connor watched her hesitation with quiet satisfaction, recognizing an opening he intended to use. When Mason connected his own diagnostic unit directly into the aircraft's systems, he expected to isolate the flicker within minutes. Instead, every trace of the earlier error vanished completely from the logs, as though it had never existed at all. He stared at the clean readout for a long moment, unwilling to trust data that contradicted what his instruments had shown him only an hour before. High above the hangar floor, behind a wall of tinted glass, Connor watched him work with an expression far too calm for a man who claimed to have nothing to hide. Mason rechecked every sensor on the tail assembly, but the strange spike from moments earlier refused to reappear. Jackson Levi, the maintenance lead and Mason's closest friend at the company, noticed that instead of panicking, Mason grew calmer and more precise with every passing minute. Mason discovered that the system log had been overwritten exactly 3 minutes before he first connected his diagnostic device to the aircraft. Only someone with senior administrative access could erase flight data that quickly and that cleanly, and very few people in the entire company held that kind of clearance. Quietly, Mason asked Jackson for a list of everyone who had been near the aircraft in the past 24 hours. Jackson told him that Connor had personally brought in an outside technical crew sometime around midnight, well after the regular maintenance shift had gone home. When questioned, Connor explained that the crew had only been updating the in-flight entertainment software in the passenger cabin, nothing more. Mason pointed out evenly, that an entertainment software update had no legitimate reason to request access to the tail control processor at all. He wanted to bring his concerns directly to Amelia, but Connor intercepted him before he could reach her office. Connor brought up Mason's situation as a single father, suggesting quietly that a man with a child depending on him should think twice before gambling his income on suspicions he could not yet prove. Mason did not raise his voice or take the bait. He simply replied that no paycheck in the world was worth more than the lives of the people who would be sitting on that aircraft. During an emergency meeting called soon after, Connor presented data suggesting the Auraline 9 was performing exactly within normal parameters. He accused Mason of deliberately sabotaging the schedule in order to pressure the company into a new licensing agreement favorable to himself. Amelia looked startled at the mention of licensing, since she had not previously understood the full history behind it. Mason explained that he had developed the core safety software years before officially joining Auraline, and that the company operated it under a long-standing agreement negotiated in good faith. Connor twisted the explanation just enough that the board began to suspect Mason was using his own technology as financial leverage against the company that employed him. Amelia gave Mason exactly 3 hours to complete a full inspection of the aircraft. If no verified fault could be found within that window, he would be required to sign off on the jet as fully airworthy. Mason refused to make that promise until he understood the true source of the earlier signal disturbance, no matter how much pressure the room placed on him. Ryan's patience thinned visibly as the meeting dragged on, and he demanded that Amelia bring her own staff under control before the investors arrived. The mounting pressure from the board slowly pushed Amelia from cautious suspicion toward open frustration with the one engineer trying to protect her company. During a brief pause in the chaos, Mason received a short call about arrangements for his child's care, and he silenced his phone without answering so he could stay focused on the crisis unfolding around him. It was a small moment barely noticed by anyone else in the room, a quiet reminder of everything he was quietly carrying outside these walls even as the company demanded every ounce of his attention. Returning to the circuit board he had pulled from the tail assembly, Mason noticed a faint residue along one edge, a chemical trace used only when a technician needed to break through a sealed security housing. Someone had opened this control unit before he ever arrived that evening, deliberately and carefully, leaving behind a trace they must have believed no one would think to check. Mason held the board under the light a moment longer, turning it slowly, already understanding that the flicker he had chased for hours was never an accident at all. Mason requested that the entire hangar be sealed off so the evidence could be preserved before anything else was touched or moved. Connor objected immediately, arguing that sealing the hangar would guarantee the flight was canceled outright, destroying months of preparation in a single decision. Amelia asked Mason to explain precisely what he suspected, her patience clearly running out after hours of circular arguments. Mason told her that someone had tampered with the tail control processor and then erased the system log to hide the intrusion completely. He admitted he could not yet prove who was responsible for the tampering, only that the evidence pointed to deliberate interference rather than a random malfunction. Connor seized the opening and pivoted smoothly, pointing out that Mason was the only person who had connected a personal diagnostic device directly to the aircraft that night. Security was ordered to search Mason's toolbox on the spot, and inside they found a circuit board nearly identical to the component that had just been removed from the tail assembly. Mason immediately understood that someone had planted it there to be discovered at exactly this moment. Jackson opened his mouth as if to speak up, then closed it again the instant Connor's eyes settled directly on him across the crowded hangar. Amelia felt something inside her harden into betrayal, convinced now that Mason had manufactured this entire crisis to manipulate the company for his own benefit. Mason asked her to check the serial number and timestamp printed on the planted component before drawing any conclusions from what security had found. Connor cut him off, declaring there was no more time left for excuses or delays of any kind. In front of more than 50 employees gathered on the hangar floor, Amelia delivered her ultimatum without hesitation. Mason would repair the aircraft before sunrise. He would personally sign a certification confirming it was safe to fly. If he failed to complete either task, he would be terminated from Auraline immediately, effective that same night. Her words landed like a physical blow, and the enormous hangar fell into a silence so complete that the ventilation system seemed loud by comparison. Mason asked her a single question in return, his voice steady despite everything happening around him. Was she asking him to repair a system that had been deliberately sabotaged, or was she asking him to hide the fact that it was never safe in the first place? Amelia answered that she was simply asking him to do the job he was paid generously to perform, nothing more and nothing less. Mason understood then that this had stopped being a technical disagreement between colleagues who respected each other's judgment. If he continued working under an ultimatum built on a false premise, he alone would carry responsibility for an aircraft that could kill everyone aboard it. Mason unclipped his employee badge and set it down carefully on the table between them without raising his voice or offering a single word of protest. He opened his locker, removed his jacket, gathered his personal files, and lifted out the small black case containing the diagnostic system he himself had spent years designing. A handful of technicians nearby began to laugh quietly, certain this was theater, a bluff meant to force Amelia's hand at the worst possible moment. Connor allowed himself a small, satisfied smile from across the room, believing the outcome he had engineered was finally within reach. Amelia stood frozen in place, anger and disbelief colliding inside her as she watched Mason actually choose to walk away rather than bend. As he pulled the security key from the diagnostic server one final time, every screen in the hangar dropped simultaneously into a restricted state none of them had ever seen triggered before. The Oraline 9 lost all ability to arm its flight control systems in that same instant, and the silence that followed was unlike anything the hangar had ever held. Connor ordered the technical team to restart the system using the master administrative account, expecting the restriction to lift within seconds. Every command they entered was rejected outright, one after another, until the terminal simply refused to accept further input at all. Jackson explained that the safety core had shifted into a protective lockdown the moment Mason's personal authentication device was disconnected from the network. Amelia decided this was retaliation, a deliberate act of sabotage by a man who had just lost his job and wanted to punish everyone around him for it. She ordered security to stop Mason before he could leave the building, unwilling to let him walk away with company property or unresolved answers. Mason calmly explained that the authentication device belonged to him personally, registered under a contract that predated his employment at Oraline by several years. He had not locked the aircraft out of spite. The system itself had automatically entered a protective state once the person legally certifying it withdrew his authorization from the network. Evelyn Madison came running into the hangar moments later, alerted by an automatic warning generated somewhere deep inside the legal department's monitoring systems. She demanded that Amelia stop pressuring Mason to surrender his device before anyone fully understood the consequences of what was happening. Evelyn revealed that Oraline held only a limited license to operate the safety core, valid solely while Mason continued serving as its independent certifying engineer. The arrangement had been established years earlier, back when his technology was first integrated into the company before he ever became a full-time employee himself. If Mason resigned under circumstances involving coercion to violate proper safety procedure, the license could be suspended across the entire fleet without warning. Not just the Oraline 9, but 14 other aircraft currently in active service could be grounded by that same suspension within days. Ryan's face went pale with fury that nobody on his own board had ever properly briefed him on a clause carrying this much weight. Evelyn revealed that Connor had repeatedly blocked the legal department from updating the intellectual property records tied to that very licensing agreement. Connor denied the accusation flatly, dismissing it as nothing more than an unfortunate administrative oversight buried somewhere in outdated paperwork. Amelia began to notice that Connor's reaction did not resemble the response of a man genuinely blindsided by an unexpected legal crisis. Mason continued packing his belongings methodically, unwilling to be drawn into another argument he had no interest in winning. He stated plainly that he would return every piece of company property in his possession, but he would never sign a false certification, not for any amount of pressure or money. Amelia asked him directly whether he truly wanted thousands of employees to lose their livelihoods over nothing more than wounded pride. Mason answered that the person truly endangering everyone's job was whoever had placed a compromised aircraft on the runway in the first place. His answer settled over the crowded hangar like a physical weight, and no one standing there attempted to speak against it. Jackson finally stepped forward from the crowd, confirming publicly that Mason had raised his concerns hours earlier, long before any of this had escalated into a public confrontation. He also admitted that Connor had once pressured the maintenance team into skipping an inspection they were contractually required to complete before signing off on flight readiness. Connor immediately threatened to have Jackson terminated on the spot for speaking out of turn in front of the assembled staff. Before anyone could respond to that threat, a new alert flashed across every monitor in the hangar, cutting through the tension like a blade. The system had detected a remote activation command actively attempting to overwrite the tail control processor at that very moment. Tracing the signal took only seconds, and what it revealed sent a fresh wave of dread through everyone still standing in that hangar. The command had originated from somewhere inside Oraline's own headquarters. Mason stopped just short of the exit doors the moment the new alert began flashing across every monitor behind him. Even though he had already resigned, something in him refused to walk away while someone was actively trying to erase the last remaining evidence. He turned back without reinstalling his authentication key, instead demanding that the aircraft be physically disconnected from the entire internal network immediately. Connor argued furiously that Mason no longer held any authority to give orders inside this building, let alone direct the response to a crisis of this magnitude. For the first time all night, Amelia did not listen to Connor at all, turning instead toward Jackson with a single clear instruction. She told him to follow exactly what Mason recommended, without hesitation and without further debate from anyone standing in that hangar. Even after the network connection was severed, the overwrite command somehow kept running, which told Mason the device sending it was never external to begin with. He concluded that whatever was issuing that command had been physically installed on the aircraft itself, hidden somewhere none of them had thought to search. Mason and Jackson began working through each technical compartment methodically, checking every access panel from nose to tail without skipping a single section. Behind a thermal insulation panel near the tail assembly, they found a small transmitter carefully concealed where no routine inspection would ever think to look. The device carried an identification code belonging to a subcontractor with known business ties, directly connecting back to Connor Wyatt. Connor insisted the identification code could easily have been falsified by someone determined to frame him for something he had nothing to do with. Amelia ordered security to temporarily collect the phones and laptops belonging to every senior manager currently present inside the building. Connor invoked his authority as chief operating officer, protesting loudly that the order exceeded whatever powers Amelia believed she held over him. Evelyn pointed out calmly that Amelia held every right to protect company assets once credible suspicion of sabotage had been formally raised. Mason warned everyone not to remove the transmitter immediately, since it might be engineered to wipe its own data or trigger a dangerous electrical fault. He carefully built a temporary isolation environment around the device, working with slow, deliberate movements that left no room for a careless mistake. While working, Mason discovered that the transmitter was mimicking correct signals throughout every phase of standard ground testing procedures, without raising a single red flag. Once the aircraft reached a specific altitude during actual flight, it would begin sending false signals that caused the tail assembly to move in direct opposition to the pilot's own commands. The Oraline 9 could take off completely normally, only to lose all meaningful control within a few catastrophic minutes of leaving the ground. The entire hangar fell into stunned disbelief as the full implication of what Mason had just explained settled over everyone present. Amelia finally understood that if Mason had signed the certification she demanded, the following morning's flight could easily have ended in catastrophe. She thought back to how she had humiliated him publicly in front of the very staff now watching this discovery unfold around them. Yet Mason made no attempt to use this moment for revenge, choosing instead to focus entirely on preserving every piece of evidence they had just uncovered. Isabella Catherine, a federal aviation safety investigator, was summoned to the hangar and arrived within the hour to begin her own examination. She ordered the scene preserved exactly as found and formally suspended tomorrow's demonstration flight until further notice was given. The $3 billion contract now stood on the edge of total collapse, threatening everything the company had worked toward for years. Ryan wanted the entire matter handled quietly and internally, desperate to avoid a scandal reaching the press or the investors. Amelia, for the first time, openly defied her own chairman, declaring in front of everyone that safety would always outweigh the price of any stock. Isabella instructed Mason to surrender his personal diagnostic equipment and remain within the immediate area until the investigation was further along. Mason cooperated without complaint, though he refused to release the master password protecting the safety core without a proper legal order authorizing it. Connor used the sudden confusion to insist, once again, that Mason had staged the entire sabotage himself from the very beginning. He argued that Mason wanted to prove the company could not survive a single day without depending entirely on him. Security footage soon surfaced showing a figure wearing a jacket resembling Mason's own walking into the hangar at exactly 2 in the morning. Amelia felt her certainty waver, since the footage appeared damning and difficult to explain away with anything Mason had told her so far. Jackson insisted that Mason had been with the overnight maintenance crew at a separate facility during that entire window of time. When investigators checked Mason's time clock records to confirm his alibi, they discovered that data had also mysteriously vanished from the system. Mason realized the person behind all of this had not simply sabotaged an aircraft but had spent considerable time building an entire chain of false evidence in advance. He asked Isabella to study the body movement captured in the security footage rather than relying solely on the jacket or the general silhouette. The figure on camera used their left hand to open the access panel, while Mason had always performed that exact motion with practiced precision using his right. Small differences in height and posture also became apparent once Isabella slowed the footage down and studied it frame by frame. Isabella agreed the footage may have been altered afterward, or that someone had gone to considerable lengths to physically disguise themselves as Mason. Mason turned his attention next to the access code used to activate the hidden transmitter hidden inside the tail assembly earlier that night. He discovered the code was a duplicate, copied directly from a login session that had actually taken place 6 months earlier. Only the chief operating officer's private backup system retained login records reaching that far back into the company's history. Amelia ordered an immediate examination of every server located inside Connor's private office suite before he had any opportunity to interfere further. Connor claimed that administrative data of that nature was fully protected under strict internal privacy policy, regardless of what Amelia believed she had authority to demand. Evelyn located an emergency provision permitting the search of any company device whenever a credible safety threat had been formally identified and documented. By the time security reached his office, Connor's personal computer had already been wiped clean through a remote command. Security did, however, discover a shattered storage drive discarded inside a wastebasket tucked beneath his desk near the far wall. Mason recognized the drive immediately as the type used inside the portable data recorders carried by outside subcontractor crews during field installations. Isabella began to suspect Connor directly, though she cautioned that suspicion alone would never be sufficient to support a formal conclusion. Behind closed doors, Connor reached out secretly to an associate waiting at a smaller regional airport several miles outside the city. He gave the order to activate a contingency plan, intending to destroy the aircraft entirely before its data could ever be fully decoded and understood. Mason, still working near the isolated transmitter, noticed an unusual fluctuation building steadily inside the auxiliary power system feeding the tail assembly. He traced the anomaly further and realized someone had deliberately programmed an overload sequence directly into the aircraft's lithium battery cluster. Thin traces of smoke began rising from the technical compartment only moments later, and the automatic fire suppression system failed to respond, because someone had disabled it hours before any of them had even arrived tonight. Mason ordered an immediate evacuation of the entire hangar the moment he confirmed smoke was rising from the technical compartment. Connor tried to keep everyone in place, worried that a full evacuation would draw unwanted attention from local reporters stationed nearby. Amelia ignored him completely and triggered the emergency alarm herself, refusing to let another single decision of his endanger anyone standing in that building. Mason explained that an overloaded battery cluster could ignite the surrounding fuel lines and potentially destroy the entire hangar structure within minutes. Fire crews needed critical time to reach the scene, leaving Mason only a narrow window to isolate the failing power source before conditions grew any worse. He pulled on protective gear and moved back toward the aircraft with Jackson close behind him, both men fully aware of the risk they were choosing to accept. Amelia wanted to follow them inside, but Mason insisted she remain at the central control station instead, coordinating from a position of safety. He guided her through reading live temperature data and cutting each affected circuit in the precise sequence he specified over the radio. This marked the very first time all night that the two of them worked together as genuine partners instead of standing on opposite sides of a conflict. Amelia finally understood that Mason had never wanted to prove her wrong in front of everyone. He simply wanted to prevent a disaster from happening. Jackson discovered that the access panel covering the battery compartment had been sealed shut using a locking mechanism that did not match the aircraft's original factory design. Mason was forced to approach from an extremely narrow crawl space beneath the cabin floor, working blind through thickening smoke that made visibility almost impossible. Meanwhile, Connor took advantage of the chaos spreading through the building to quietly attempt an exit from company headquarters altogether. Evelyn discovered that he had just transferred a substantial sum of money into an account held overseas, evidence of planning that stretched back much further than tonight. Amelia ordered security to detain him immediately, but by the time they reached the executive floor, Connor had already disappeared entirely from the building. Mason managed to isolate half of the battery cluster, only to watch the dangerous overload sequence shift automatically toward a secondary backup power source instead. He understood now that whoever designed this sabotage possessed deep technical knowledge of the Aralene 9's internal architecture. Knowledge that only a small handful of people could ever have obtained. Jackson suffered a minor injury when a loose metal panel snapped free and struck his shoulder hard enough to knock him briefly off balance. Mason insisted that Jackson leave the aircraft immediately for his own safety, choosing to continue the dangerous work completely alone from that point forward. Amelia guided him carefully through the remaining technical schematics, reading every measurement aloud with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She faced an impossible choice between saving an $80 million aircraft or destroying an irreplaceable prototype system in order to guarantee everyone's safety. Mason told her plainly to destroy the system entirely if that was what it took to save the people around them and the hangar itself. Amelia hesitated only a few agonizing seconds before giving the final order to cut all primary power running through the aircraft. Mason disconnected the last remaining coupling only moments before the battery cluster erupted in a contained localized burst of heat and sparks. The isolated system held, and the fire never reached the nearby fuel tanks, sparing the hangar from a catastrophe that had seemed almost certain minutes earlier. Mason was carried out of the aircraft utterly exhausted, coughing from the smoke, yet fully alert and coherent the entire time paramedics examined him. Every employee gathered outside watched him with an expression of genuine respect that had completely replaced the mockery from earlier that same night. As firefighters finally brought the scene under full control, Isabella reported that Connor had vanished from the area entirely, and that a second Aralene 9 was already preparing for takeoff at a nearby regional airport. The second Aralene 9 was carrying a small group of test engineers and had already begun taxiing steadily toward the runway for departure. That aircraft shared the exact same batch of components and the exact same software version installed on the original prototype earlier that night. Isabella demanded the airport halt the departure immediately, but ground communication cut out unexpectedly at the worst possible moment. Amelia realized Connor had prepared this second disaster deliberately, intending it as a distraction to pull attention away from the ongoing investigation. Mason had barely recovered from the fire, yet he returned to the control terminal without hesitation the instant he learned what was unfolding. He determined that an emergency safety command could still reach the aircraft through an independent satellite link unaffected by the communication blackout. That command, however, would only function if he restored the safety core license he had personally withdrawn hours earlier that same night. Restoring it meant Mason would once again carry full legal responsibility for every system operating across the entire fleet. If the second aircraft suffered any kind of failure, Mason alone could lose everything and potentially face criminal prosecution for the outcome. Amelia refused to ask that of him, unwilling to place that impossible burden back onto his shoulders after everything he had already endured tonight. Instead, she turned to face the board and every remaining employee and publicly accepted full responsibility for the ultimatum she had issued earlier that evening. She declared without hesitation that she would never again use anyone's livelihood or safety as leverage to force Mason's hand. Mason understood in that moment that Amelia had genuinely grasped the very thing he had been trying to protect throughout this entire ordeal. He agreed to reactivate the emergency license for exactly 10 minutes, on the condition that every single command issued during that window be fully logged. Mason transmitted a takeoff lock signal directly to the second Aralene 9 as it continued accelerating steadily down the runway toward liftoff. The pilot received the warning just as the aircraft began building speed, and the automatic system reduced thrust before reaching the point of no return. A hidden sabotage device nearly identical to the first was discovered inside the tail assembly of this second aircraft during the emergency inspection that followed. There was no longer any doubt that Orlean was facing a coordinated and carefully organized conspiracy rather than a single isolated act of sabotage. Isabella traced the origin of the control signal back to a private hangar located just outside the boundary of the regional airport itself. Traffic cameras nearby captured Connor's vehicle arriving at that very location only a short time before the failed takeoff attempt occurred. Mason discovered that the hidden transmitter contained an identification code belonging to a rival aviation company competing directly against Orlean for the same contract. He cautioned everyone, however, that the code could easily have been planted deliberately in order to mislead investigators toward the wrong conclusion entirely. Amelia and Isabella agreed not to release any of this information publicly until they had gathered far more conclusive evidence to support it. Instead, they arranged for a false signal suggesting all recovered aircraft data had already been permanently destroyed in the earlier fire. Believing the evidence was gone, Connor made contact with his associate to coordinate their next move, unknowingly revealing his exact location during that same call. Investigators closed in quickly, tracking the signal to the private hangar, where Connor had been hiding since fleeing company headquarters earlier that night. Just before agents reached him, Connor triggered a data file that had been scheduled in advance to release automatically to several major news outlets. The file falsely accused both Amelia and Mason of concealing a fatal safety defect from regulators and the public for years, a claim designed to destroy them both at once. News of the leaked file spread rapidly across financial outlets before authorities had even managed to take Connor into custody. Orlean's stock price collapsed within hours, wiping out a significant portion of its market value in a single devastating morning. Investors demanded Amelia's immediate resignation, unwilling to wait for a full and proper investigation into what had actually happened. The board quietly pushed to place the entire blame on Mason instead, hoping to protect the company's public image at his expense. Ryan offered Mason a substantial payment in exchange for signing a statement accepting responsibility for what he called a data management failure. Mason refused without a single moment of hesitation, unwilling to trade his integrity for a number written on a check. He told Ryan plainly that the truth could never be repaired by burying it beneath yet another convenient lie. Amelia now stood at the center of an impossible decision that would define the remainder of her career at Orlean. She could sacrifice Mason entirely to preserve her position, or she could expose every failure publicly and risk losing the company altogether. She chose to hold a joint press conference alongside federal investigators, refusing to hide behind carefully worded statements crafted by legal counsel. Standing before employees and reporters, Amelia admitted openly that she alone had issued the ultimatum that nearly caused 2 catastrophic failures within a single day. She confirmed that Mason had repeatedly warned her of danger, and that senior leadership had chosen to ignore him at every turn. Amelia offered no excuse rooted in board pressure or in Connor's quiet manipulation behind the scenes throughout the entire crisis. She accepted full and complete responsibility for the decision that had placed so many lives in danger that night. Mason then presented the technical evidence himself, using plain language so that even those unfamiliar with aviation systems could clearly understand what had occurred. He proved conclusively that the sabotage had been introduced after the aircraft completed its final certification, not before, as Connor had originally claimed. Isabella laid out the complete case against Connor Wyatt for everyone gathered in that room to hear without interruption. Counterfeit components had entered Orlean's supply chain through a shell company established specifically to disguise their true origin. Connor had received payments from a secret fund traced back through several layers of shell accounts and offshore transfers. Mason's personal access codes had been duplicated using data pulled from a login session recorded many months earlier that same year. Security footage from that critical night had been carefully altered to implicate Mason, using a body double-dressed to resemble him. The battery overload sequence had been engineered specifically to destroy evidence rather than occurring as any kind of accidental malfunction. Jackson submitted a collection of emails proving that Connor had repeatedly instructed the maintenance team to bypass required safety inspections over several months. Connor was finally apprehended while attempting to leave the private regional hangar where investigators had tracked him earlier that same evening. Under questioning, he claimed his original goal had only been to cause the flight to fail without causing any actual harm to passengers. Mason rejected that explanation entirely, pointing out that any interference with flight control systems carried the real possibility of killing everyone aboard the aircraft. The rival company had not directly ordered the sabotage, but a group of its senior managers had paid Connor generously to steal Oraline's proprietary technology. The investigation expanded rapidly in the following days, pulling in additional witnesses and financial records tied to the conspiracy. The board voted to suspend Amelia despite her honesty, and Mason now held the legal power to shut down Oraline's entire operation permanently through the licensing clause tied to his own technology. Instead of walking away, Mason requested one final meeting with every employee before deciding what to do about the license going forward. Most people assumed he intended to demand a fortune, a share of ownership, or perhaps the chief executive position itself. Ryan arrived prepared to offer an enormous compensation package, certain that money alone could resolve whatever Mason ultimately wanted from the company. Mason turned down every single offer placed in front of him without a moment's consideration. He presented 4 conditions instead, conditions required before he would agree to restore the license on any kind of long-term basis. Oraline would establish an independent safety division answering to neither the chief executive nor the board of directors. Every engineer would gain the authority to halt a flight over any safety concern without fear of punishment or termination. The company would formally protect employees who reported wrongdoing, and every component across the fleet would undergo independent reinspection immediately. Mason wanted nothing resembling a higher title or greater personal power within the company's existing structure of authority. He simply wanted to ensure that no engineer would ever again be forced to choose between a paycheck and a passenger's life. One by one, employees throughout the hangar stepped forward to stand visibly behind him as he spoke. Jackson apologized for staying silent during the moment Mason had been wrongly accused in front of the entire staff. Mason did not blame him harshly, though he gently reminded Jackson that silence in the face of wrongdoing carries its own quiet cost. Ryan had no real choice but to accept every condition since most of the engineering staff threatened to walk out together if Mason left. The board wanted Amelia removed permanently, unwilling to give her any further opportunity to lead the company forward. Mason did not fight to protect her position, but he pointed out that her public admission of fault showed she was still capable of real change. He suggested that the decision be left instead to the employees themselves, along with a newly formed independent ethics committee. Amelia was allowed to remain in her role during a 6-month probationary period, operating under closer oversight than she had ever faced before. She apologized to Mason directly, standing in front of the very people who had witnessed her humiliate him only days earlier. Her apology carried no excuses and no attempt to justify what she had done under pressure that night. Mason accepted her apology, though he made clear that genuine trust would need to be rebuilt slowly through consistent action over time. Oraline suspended every flight across its fleet for 3 full weeks while independent teams completed a thorough safety reinspection. The decision caused significant financial losses, yet not a single additional incident occurred throughout the entire suspension period. Federal regulators ultimately chose to delay rather than cancel the contract outright, citing the company's new commitment to transparency as a deciding factor. Amelia later offered Mason the newly created position of Vice President of Aviation Safety, a role built specifically around everything he had fought for. He did not answer right away, choosing instead to look out toward the Oraline 9 as technicians carefully disassembled it for a complete inspection from the ground up. The hangar around them had changed in ways that went far beyond new procedures and updated paperwork on a shelf somewhere. Everyone present understood that something fundamental about how this company operated had shifted permanently that week, and Mason simply watched the careful work continue in silence. 6 months later, Oraline Aviation had completed its full restructuring, emerging as a very different company than the one that had nearly collapsed that night. Connor and his co-conspirators faced formal charges of sabotage, fraud, and conspiracy to endanger an aircraft carrying innocent passengers. Ryan left the board entirely after investigators discovered he had repeatedly ignored earlier governance warnings that should have prevented much of this crisis. Amelia remained chief executive, though she no longer led the company through fear or intimidation the way she once had. She attended every safety meeting personally, listened carefully to junior engineers, and never again pressured anyone into signing a certification against their own judgment. Mason accepted the vice president of safety position, but only under the condition that his division remain fully independent from executive influence. He still spent most of his time down on the hangar floor, working alongside technicians instead of remaining isolated inside a private office upstairs. The Oraline 9 had been fully rebuilt from the ground up and now stood ready for a brand new demonstration flight. This time, Amelia asked Mason directly whether the aircraft was truly ready, rather than issuing an ultimatum demanding immediate results. Mason performed one final, thorough inspection before signing the certification using his own name, without pressure and without hesitation. He explained that the aircraft was ready to fly not because a deadline had arrived, but because every legitimate question had finally been properly answered. Amelia invited him to sit in the executive cabin during the flight as an honored guest of the company. Mason declined the honorary seat and chose instead to remain in the technical center alongside the team he trusted most. The demonstration flight was completed successfully, and Oraline secured the contract it had come so close to losing months earlier. This time, the achievement was never treated as a personal triumph belonging solely to the chief executive or any single leader. A new principle now hung on the hangar wall, visible to every employee who walked through those doors each morning. It stated plainly that any person, regardless of title or seniority, held the authority to halt an unsafe flight without question. The story reached its quiet conclusion as Amelia watched Mason close his toolbox at the end of another long working day. This time, he was not packing to leave the company forever, the way he had been that very first night. He was simply preparing for the next scheduled inspection, exactly as he had done countless times before across many years. Amelia finally understood that the man who had once silenced an entire hangar full of people had never done so through the value of his technology alone. Mason had done it because he was the only person in that building willing to lose everything just to make sure that no one else would ever have to lose their life. If this story moved you, imagine what happens when the quiet ones finally decide to speak.